I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, Divided We Fall. We look at political upheaval in America, past and present. We'll discuss how one issue, the Israel-Gaza war, is dividing Democrats and could have major implications in November. But first, we look back at America at its most divided. In the mid-19th century, when it was on the brink of civil war, journalism was shaping public opinion by providing both propaganda and news, and immigration was helping determine the political career of a president. Abraham Lincoln biographer and Civil War scholar Harold Holzer joins us. His latest book, Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. Harold currently serves as director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Harold, this is your 56th book on either Lincoln or the Civil War. What else left is there to say?
Maybe nothing. That's why
I doubt it.
That's why I'm glad I tackled immigration, because it hadn't really been looked at in the context of Lincoln's career.
And of course, we're coming up on Lincoln's birthday as well. What is the difference in the debate over immigration between then and now? And of course, then, as you point out in the book, when your grandparents came at the end of the 19th century, there were virtually no barriers to immigration. So now when we talk about illegal immigration, undocumented immigrants, people crossing the border without papers, that has to be in the context of the fact that when Lincoln was president, there were no rules. People could come at any time for any reason.
It's fascinating because the states had the assumed power of policing immigration. And, you know, they would do head taxes to collect money in case the new immigrants were indigent and needed public assistance or hospitalization. They would reduce tonnage or increase tonnage requirements on transatlantic ships because most people came in cargo ships. But the feds only had constitutional power on naturalization. So the rule was, by Congress, 5 years in, and you were automatically eligible for citizenship and voting rights. And no, yes, you're right, no border walls, no razor wire, no ICE, no constraints. Of course there was pushback, and there was resentment, and there was bigotry.
By the last people who had come in.
Exactly, exactly. And so the Irish particularly had a rough time, and then the Germans when they came a little bit later. And that's when it became, that's when nativism sprung up as a political force in the United States in the late 40s and early 50s.
I had no idea that Lincoln was a proponent of immigration. He wanted to provide jobs. Ultimately, he needed more cannon fodder for the Civil War.
Right.
What was his motivation? Was it because he was pressured by business? Was it because he needed people for the draft? Was it an ethical, moral question that America was the beacon for the world?
So I think it's reasonable to say all of the above. And by the way, in the early days, before he became president, while he had a moral position that, as he once put it to German Americans, you are the blood of our founders. Not poisoning the blood, but the blood of our founders. He did do a little bit of a flirtation dance with nativists and know-nothings in the mid-50s because he thought that he could get members of their movement to join his anti-slavery coalition. So he never quite denounced know-nothingism specifically and publicly, only to his friends and colleagues privately. So that's the kind of the low point. But in terms of his ethics on immigration, it was that the United States should provide opportunity, that it was an open door, and the welcome mat should be put out on the open door.
Only to Europeans, though.
Yeah, I say that in the book for sure. In fact, he signed what was reprehensibly called the Cooley Act of 1862, which prevented Chinese from immigrating, even though they'd been welcomed on the West Coast to help build the railroads, because even progressives believed that indentured laborers coming in across the Pacific was a kind of revival of the slave trade. At least that was their argument. So yes, it was all European immigration. That's all they conceived. It was all an East Coast phenomenon. But during the Civil War, yes, Lincoln specifically needed men to replenish the army, which by the time he introduced this landmark legislation in '63, we'd had about 400,000 casualties in the armed forces and hundreds of thousands of injuries, people who were never going to work again. And as Lincoln said in his State of the Union message in December '63, we need men not only for the army, but for the mines, the farms, and the factories. So he did something so radical that it's never been attempted again or even discussed. He offered federal subsidies for transatlantic voyages, a bridge too far for Congress.
So what's the difference now, that we don't need people for the Army, that there aren't enough jobs, or the attitude of Americans has simply changed?
I think we've been pummeled into believing we don't need workers. I think we do need workers. We kind of famously still have vacancies in a lot of the farming and service industries that immigrants have always accepted when second-generation people won't. If people complain about fruit and vegetable prices being too high just to get to a granular level here, one of the reasons is that a lot of crops are left to die on the vine because there are no seasonal workers to harvest them. And that's what we seem to have forgotten. The idea of the resentment about people streaming across our border at a rate of a few thousand a day is not all that much different proportionately than the number of Irish and German and French and Swedish and Polish immigrants who came down the gangplank at Castle Garden in the 1850s. And by the way, Lincoln's army was 23% foreign born. It was the Foreign Legion of the United States, and German and Irish who may have opposed Lincoln in politics, may have opposed anti-slavery in politics, willingly joined the campaign to save the Union.
So what is different today? Are we all being conned that we don't want immigrants, we shouldn't have immigrants, immigrants are costing us, or is there a real reason to close the borders, or at least to police the borders better than we have?
I think we a little bit have been conned into thinking that immigrants are a drain and not a benefit to society. History tells us otherwise. I think obviously it's not a country of 31 million people anymore as it was in the Civil War era.
And there aren't wide open spaces anymore.
There aren't many wide open spaces, but there are opportunities that native-born people seem unwilling to fill and undertake. And Lincoln really believed in the replenishment of democracy and the allure of America as a haven and as a place where anyone could make it, as the song goes, New York and elsewhere. So I do think that we've lost sight of our original commitment, a commitment that George Washington had and Thomas Jefferson had and Lincoln had. And we've seemed to have reverted to the know-nothing position that immigrants are nothing but a detriment and a drain. And I just don't think historically that's provable.
Is that because there are fewer Europeans coming in and there are more from Latin South America, from Asia? Is there a difference there? Is there a racial, ethnic element to this?
I think there is a racial and ethnic element, although looking back at the 1850s, people were horrified that Catholics were coming in, that people who might have a higher allegiance to the Pope than the president were coming in, that they dared to...
They had that in 1962.
They did indeed. But the idea that Catholics in Philadelphia wanted to read Bible passages in school from a Catholic Bible as opposed to a Protestant Bible touched off about 3 weeks of violent rioting in Philadelphia that was so spectacularly controversial that Lincoln, all the way in Springfield, Illinois, helped convene a meeting at which his fellow Whig Party members absolved themselves of responsibility for fomenting violence. And Lincoln said for the first time that the doors of the country ought to be open to people who educate themselves about America. That was his one contingency there, which is kind of interesting.
And how did he define educating themselves? That they had to assimilate, or?
He didn't define, but he did believe firmly in assimilation. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine the foreign accents that existed in the culture in the Civil War era. First of all, 51% of New York City was foreign born at the dawn of the Civil War.
10 million immigrants had come in the
almost
preceding couple of decades, you said.
Absolutely. And Lincoln's private secretary was German. As it turned out, he didn't get his citizenship papers.
When he delivered Lincoln's speech to Congress, you pointed out.
Right. Lincoln actively recruited Germans to raise regiments in the West and Irishmen in New York City. He wanted Michael Corcoran, a Fenian Brotherhood hero, and Thomas Francis Meagher. Corcoran had been court-martialed for not assembling the 69th Regiment to salute the Prince of Wales when he came through. He would not allow the Irish troops to salute the heir to the British throne. He was about to be court-martialed, and Lincoln, in consultation with the Archbishop of New York City, which is something no president had ever spoken to a prince of the church about anything, let alone recruitment, agreed that Corcoran had to lead the way for Irish recruitment in New York. And he did. He was captured at Bull Run, but he served his purpose.
Harold, people say things are worse now in this country. There's more polarization, there's more division now than at least any time since the Civil War. Is that an exaggeration, do you think?
I do think it's an exaggeration. If you mentioned in your introduction that the press conveyed news but also propaganda, and every newspaper in the country at that point, at the dawn of the war, was either pro-Republican or pro-Democrat.
Not just on editorial page.
Certainly not. Every piece of news was reported differently, and you could just see each bit of coverage going through the filter of partisan understanding and partisan interpretation. So we were more divided because ultimately we did divide into northern and southern factions, and a civil war ensued. I don't think there's any comparison to that. So yeah, the good old days were tough, and the terrible times today are not as bad as they were in 1860.
You also wrote a book, The Presidents and the Press.
Right.
What's different between then and now? Or have presidents always not gone along with the press? And should they get along with the press? Or should the press get along with presidents?
I don't think they should be buddies, as they have been occasionally. And I said in that book, you're making me go back 4 years, but the first president to complain about fake news was George Washington. He called it false news, but he took a newspaper and threw it to the floor and jumped on it and crushed it with his boots because they had defamed him. So we've always had partisan reporting. The MSNBC Fox dynamic played out in print. I said in that book that the most successful communicators among presidents are those who conquered media that allowed them to step outside of normal day-to-day press coverage. And that included FDR with his fireside chats and newsreels, Fox Movie Toe News. It included JFK with his televised press conferences, Barack Obama with a website that had never been done before, and Donald Trump with social media. Mm-hmm. They managed to get their message across, whatever the denunciations of the press were. And FDR never got majority editorial endorsement in any of his 4 races for president.
Speaking of social media, Harold, you point out in the book that research on a topic like this is so much different than when you first started writing books, started writing at all. To me, it almost feels guilty because it's so easy.
You're the second person in 2 days to say, did you feel a little guilty about the access? No, but I do miss the excitement of finding something, just you've done this too, right? Rummaging through records, and suddenly you have an aha moment. There's something that everyone has missed. And the ease of whatever entering a keyword now is so seductive, but it does make you more productive. And I guess that assuages the guilt somewhat.
I guess you have to be more careful too, because not everything you find is true.
Well, you sure have to be careful if you rely on Wikipedia, and we tell this to our students at Hunter as well. But in terms of calling up a pamphlet that German immigrant Francis Lieber, who wrote the Lieber Code, published in support of Lincoln in both German and English, why would Germans vote for anyone else? There aren't too many of them left. So it's kind of nice to call it up on Google Books and leaf through it with a mouse. That part is just, it saves days and makes you more productive. So that I think scholars are the better for it, and I hope readers get more information. I did not realize until I started this book that publisher James Harper of New York, who founded Harper's Weekly and Harper Publishing, was not only mayor of New York, but he was a nativist. He ran on a nativist ticket to stop the flow of the Irish into New York City. So it's not unusual for migrants to stir political battles in New York.
Harold Holzer of Hunter College's Roosevelt Institute, the author of Brought Forth on This Continent. And coming up next, how Israel and Gaza has divided Democrats today. According to our next guest, 4 months since Hamas attacked Israel, there's been collateral damage on congressional races in this country. Journalist and novelist Ross Barkan joins us now. His recent piece, How October 7th Drove a Wedge into the Democratic Party, available at nytimes.com and in this week's New York Times Magazine section. Ross, thanks for joining us. You talk about parallels between this, Black Lives Matter, and the split in the Democratic Party over the war in Vietnam. What are the parallels? What are the differences?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Similarities certainly in the size and scope of the protests to the Black Lives Matter protests, especially after George Floyd was killed in 2020. You're seeing a lot of the same energy, a lot of the same zeal, not the same sloganeering, but some of the same organizers and activists who are interested in one issue and now have moved into this arena as well, along with a long-standing Palestinian advocacy that's always been there. And then the Vietnam comparison is very interesting, and I think the similarity is the generational cleavage, the difference between how the older voters and older people in America view the conflict in Gaza and view Israel's treatment versus how young people see Israel now. And you see it in polling, you see it anecdotally. There is a huge difference between how people 35 and younger see Israel and how people over 35, over 45 see it. And that probably is the biggest similarity, along with the upheaval at college campuses, which you saw, of course, in the 1960s. And you're seeing to an extent today as well.
Ross, we're seeing in Republican primaries, congressional primaries in particular, what we might call or might used to have called moderate Republicans being challenged by more conservative right-wing ones. What's happening to more progressive Democrats, if you will, being challenged by more conservative or more pro-Israel Democrats in congressional races?
Yeah. So what you saw in the late 2010s was progressive insurgents running against moderate Democrats in House primaries. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defeats Joe Crowley. Jamal Bowman defeats Eliot Engel. Typically, these progressive insurgents were outgunned, at least initially. Now you're seeing ideologically the reverse of that. You're seeing these progressive incumbents, these leftist incumbents getting strong primaries from very well-funded moderate challengers who are running on the Israel issue, but also talking about other issues as well. But probably more importantly, are going to be very well-funded by Israel advocates, by AIPAC, by Democratic Majority for Israel, which is not affiliated with AIPAC but shares its views and endorses Democrats. So whether it's Jamal Bowman getting primaried by George Latimer, the Westchester County executive, whether it's Ilhan Omar in Minnesota getting a primary, whether it's other squad Democrats throughout the country, Summer Lee in Pennsylvania, the ideological script has flipped and the money now is against them, but they are also strong fundraisers. So it's going to be very interesting what happens in these next few months with these primaries.
We're going to see something a lot sooner in the race to succeed George Santos.
Yes, and you have a special election, Democrat versus Republican, which I wrote about in Nassau County, where Mazi Pilip, who is a former IDF member, she's Israeli and Ethiopian. She's the Republican candidate. She's up against Tom Suozzi, who was congressman there for a long time. Both are very pro-Israel. Pilip has the edge in actually being Israeli and having been in the IDF, and it's very personal for her, and that's a very heavily Jewish district, a district that traditionally has been represented by Democrats. It flipped to Santos. Swazi is the favorite, but how voters choose the candidates is going to be very interesting because Israel, along with immigration, is going to be a top issue in everyone's minds this Tuesday.
One reader, in response to your article online, said, all that is apparently required, talking about anti-Semitism, is to find the right language to hide behind: decolonization, oppression, Zionism, genocide, and everyone who supports the most vile actions against humanity can go home and sleep well. So how much of this is anti-Semitic and how much of it is pro-Palestinian? And how do you separate Hamas from the Palestinians?
Yeah, well, I think they can be separated. You know, Hamas has been in power since 2007. They are not a democratic organization. They are certainly a radical right-wing organization. The people of Gaza have been living in misery and fear for a very long time. Are there anti-Semites who are also anti-Zionists? Yes. Are all anti-Zionist anti-Semites? No. And you have a lot of activists and some politicians and people who are very concerned with how the Netanyahu government is currently prosecuting the war. Obviously, Hamas attacked first, killed 1,200 civilians and took hostages. Israel now has killed at least 27,000 people in Gaza. It's a staggering number, and it's not clear what the end game will be. Tragically, you have maximalists on both sides. The Israeli government has swung hard to the right. Hamas is a very difficult negotiating partner. The two-state solution right now appears dead, in that the Netanyahu government doesn't want to give the Palestinians a state. Certainly Hamas is not in a position to run one. And tragically, it's not clear how this can be solved. And we've been here for decades saying that, but more so than ever, it is a very dark situation, and that trickles over into the American political scene.
Ross Barkan, you wrote a magazine piece in the Times last year that said, if you think Trump can't win, look at 1968. What did you mean?
So I was looking at the Republican primary, and at the time, Ron DeSantis was not quite a front runner, but he was polling fairly well and was accumulating money and some endorsements. And I was comparing Donald Trump to Richard Nixon's position in 1968, where both had been left for dead in their respective Republican parties. Nixon had run for governor and lost. He was really an outcast. Trump was being discounted, in my view, because he had backed losing candidates in the 2022 midterms, and he was someone who seemed to be on the out, certainly if you read a lot of the coverage and a lot of how the punditry was regarding him. So Nixon and Trump, very different figures. I don't want to compare them too much, but they both were in positions to make comebacks, and in my view, Trump had some of what Nixon had, where he was in a position to claim a Republican nomination again that many believed he could not. And as we see right now, Trump is on his way to winning the Republican nomination once more. The Republican Party is his. Whether he wins like Nixon in '68 is another question. I don't want to prognosticate that far ahead, but certainly you see some of those parallels right now. And within the divisions in the Democratic Party, perhaps emboldening Trump or helping him to some degree. We'll see what happens. Again, I don't want to predict too much, but certainly Trump is very formidable right now.
That's wisely prudent. Ross Barkan in the New York Times Sunday Magazine, thanks for joining us. Coming up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on the city budget. The mayor, the city council, and the state comptroller are debating the size of the city's deficit. They might want to explore some out-of-the-box suggestions from the Independent Budget Office. Every year around this time, the IBO releases its budget alternatives. Most are too incendiary politically to be considered seriously. Some, given their potential impact on the city's economy, may not even make much sense. But they raise questions that city and state officials ought to be asking, at least. Numbers can be numbing, but these are worth listening to. The commuter tax was repealed in 1999, a favor to disgraced Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver. He was helping to help a suburban Democrat struggling to be reelected. Restoring the tax would raise $1.2 billion a year. Should the city be spending $139 million to underwrite the safety and transportation budgets for non-public schools, and another $75 million to subsidize the rent for charter schools? Do we need separate building, housing, and fire inspections? Combining them would be cheaper for the city and for property owners, too. They'll only have to bribe one inspector, not three. An extra 3% sales tax on alcohol would generate $200 million. Extending the mortgage recording tax to co-ops would reap $100 million. Increasing fines for landlords who fail to fix the facades of their buildings, that's why the city is girded in scaffolding, would raise $150 million. Here's one we can probably discard immediately: charging New Yorkers for how much garbage they dispose of. Pay as you throw. It could yield $400 million. The IBO also says the city could collect nearly $500 million by hiking fines for motorists who repeatedly violate school zone speeding and red light camera violations. The fine point in that proposal includes an alarming statistic. Last year, 66,000 vehicles each amassed 10 or more violations. Like congestion pricing before them, the IBO's proposals are not perfect solutions. But before we close libraries and reduce other services, before the city seems dirtier and in some cases less safe, maybe it's time to milk some of these sacred cows. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.